is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. My name is Mindy Muller, and I'm going to be leading you through this webinar today on effective performance evaluations. I'm joined here in our office by Audrey Phillips, a member of CDP's nonprofit development team, and she is our staff lead for CDP membership. She and I will be fielding questions as they come through today. So I invite you to ask questions. If you look at your panel, you should see a questions panel, and we can field those questions anytime throughout the presentation. So I invite you to ask questions. If they are relevant to the entire audience, then certainly we'll try and cover those during the course of the webinar. If those pertain specifically to your organization, then certainly send those questions, but we may choose to just get with you individually to respond to those questions. Also on your control panel, you should see handouts, and there are two handouts for this particular presentation. One is a handout of the slides so that you can have a record of that. The other is the actual evaluations that we're going to be reviewing. So if you have an opportunity, you might want to go ahead and print those even while we get started here, particularly the evaluations portion of those, so that you have those in front of you when we start that particular portion of the presentation. So a couple other housekeeping items. You all are muted, so you should be able to hear me, but I cannot hear you, and you cannot hear each other, so that you can feel free to talk in your office as you need to do that. You also should be able to see my screen, which is effective performance evaluation. You should be able to see that. So if there are any questions with regard to being able to hear or to see, please go ahead and let us know that by responding to the questions portion of the control panel. So performance evaluations is being offered today by community development professionals. It's part of our commitment to help nonprofits get organized and get funded. If you have attended anything that we've done, you're going to hear that phrase a lot. Get organized, get funded. CDP was founded in 2003 by a team of professionals who are really passionate about making a difference in communities. Our mission is to partner with community organizations to grow and nurture viable communities. And our approach to community development is to really increase the capacity of individual organizations so that you can serve your community better. So this particular workshop falls into one of our 6 areas of nonprofit organizational development. We're going to go over those in a minute, but a little bit of our agenda over the next hour or so. We're going to talk a little bit about the background of why we do this particular training on effective performance evaluations. Then we're going to walk to some how-tos. So making sure this is practical for you and how to do this well. We're going to walk through some effective evaluations and what makes an evaluation effective. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking through the examples that we're providing for you. Point out some things that are positive and some things that you might want to consider when doing evaluations. So as I mentioned, CDP divides nonprofits into 6 different areas. And all of these areas are really important. We have, the first is legalities. Legalities really covers the basic infrastructure of a nonprofit. It's making sure that you are operating in compliance with all required documents, both state documents, federal documents, and your own governing documents like your bylaws. It also is making sure that you are operating with integrity and transparency. So it includes ensuring that you have and retain your 501c3 status, that you stay in good relationship with what you need to do at the state, making sure that you have policies and procedures, good fiscal controls, making sure you're filing your 990 with the IRS every year. We really encourage nonprofits to have 3 professional partners. And so legalities covers those as well. So an accountant, an insurance agent, and an attorney that you can rely on. So that's the legalities portion of a nonprofit. The second portion is board governance. Board governance is really talking about what makes a strong board of directors, making sure they understand their role and responsibility, making sure they operate legally, fiscally, are responsible, that they are operating ethically, just to make sure boards have the information they need to govern well and to do their job well. We also talk about their role in terms of long-term planning, visioning, strategizing, all of those kinds of components. The third area of a healthy nonprofit is image management, what we used to refer to as image development. It's really about everything you do in terms of marketing and public relations. So how is it that you're intentionally going about getting the word out about your organization, what it is that you do, whether that's marketing materials, what you do on social media, how you interface with the media through press releases, all of those kinds of things, logos and branding, all of that is image management. And so how do you do that as an organization? That's an important component. The fourth component is resource development. Those are the people, the stuff, and the money that you need to do what it is that you do as an organization. So we work with nonprofits to help you plan out how you're going to do resource development, how you're going to bring in the resources you need to do the work that you're about doing. The fifth area of nonprofits is strategic planning. So that's your long-term visioning. It's really a primary responsibility of the board to make sure that gets done. But how do we strategize about where we're going and how we're going to get there? All of those things are part of strategic planning. And then the last area is really program impact. How do we know that what we're doing in the community is making a difference? What are the outcomes from our programs, and are we attaining those? And how do we know that we're doing that? So just making sure that everything we do in the nonprofit is impactful, that we're being intentional about making a difference and measuring that indeed we are. So all of those kinds of elements are under the area of program impact. So all 6 of those components are important, and they all need to be in balance to make a healthy nonprofit. Healthy nonprofits are sustainable nonprofits, and so we really care that you're doing all of these things well so that you can continue to make an impact in the community that you're serving. So this particular workshop under program or under evaluations and performance evaluations falls really under the area of legalities. It's all of the things that you need to do to make sure that you're staying in compliance, that you have good human resource management, and that you are moving the organization forward with your evaluations. So we're going to start with the background of why is it that we do this training. So as we look at doing performance evaluations, there are some things we need to consider. So let's start by talking about what is an effective performance evaluation. When we think about performance evaluations, it's exactly what it suggests that it is. When we are doing a role or doing a job, we need to make sure that we're doing it well, that we're doing it with excellence, that we're being effective in the role that we're playing. So when we talk about performance evaluations, we're talking about, yes, it's a point-in-time evaluation. So sometimes we see these done every year, maybe on your anniversary date, or all of them are done at the same time. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But it is a point-in-time look at how are we doing in our role, in our performance, in the role that we play in an organization. So it is a point-in-time process, but it's also an ongoing process. We can't expect to cover in one point-in-time meeting everything that's good and bad in the role that someone plays in the organization. So it is not just point in time, it's also a series of conversations that we're having. Whether we're talking about boards, talking about the executive director, or the staff, we need to be having ongoing conversations throughout the term of their employment or the term that they're in that role to let them know how they're doing, so that it's a give and take. We're telling them the positives and we're giving them constructive feedback on what they can do better. So it is point in time, and it's also an ongoing process. An effective performance evaluation is also based on setting clear expectations. So that is our job when we're in a position of authority in an organization, to make sure that we are setting out clear expectations. Everyone that's getting an evaluation, whether we're going to talk about the CEO or executive director, whether we're talking about a staff person, or whether we're talking about the board, all of those roles should have clear job descriptions. This is what you're being charged with doing. This is what your role is in the organization and what the expected activities are, the tasks are for your particular job. And so we need to have clear job descriptions for every role in which we're going to be doing an evaluation. Secondly, based on those clear expectations, we need to have reasonable and consistent standards. I need to know what I'm being measured against. So not only do I need to know what my role function is, I also need to know what is the standard by which I'm being measured. So if you expect me to do donor development as part of my executive director role, what is your standard for whether or not I'm doing that well? So that every role, every activity, every task that I'm being charged with doing has a standard that I know I'm being held up against. We have to make sure that we're defining those clearly. We cannot have an effective performance evaluation if we have not laid out what the reasonable and consistent standards are for that particular role. The third piece of this is I need to be able to provide coaching and training for my staff or the CEO, executive director, or the board. There needs to not only just be laid out, here's what's expected, but there needs to be in place the coaching and training so that I can improve in that area. Sometimes what we fail or fall short on in doing performance evaluations is telling people where they're falling short of expectations, but we do not have a way for them to grow into doing and meeting that standard, doing that job with excellence. We as organizations need to be sure that we have coaching and training available to our staff or our boards so that they can improve in the areas where they may be falling short. So all of that is important when we talk about making sure there's an effective performance evaluation. It needs to be both point in time and ongoing, a series of conversations that we're having over the course of employment or the course of their term on the board. We need to have clear expectations, a job description. We need to have defined reasonable and consistent standards they're being measured against. And we need to have coaching and training available to them. So any area that they're falling short in, there's a way that they can rectify that. An effective performance evaluation also is supported by feedback on performance expectations. So this would include recognition and achievement. So we need to know what they did well. We need to be able to communicate to them. We recognize that you do these things really well. You achieved here and this area really well. So we want to build on what they've done well, what their strengths are, what the expected result was, and how they achieved that. We need to make sure we're giving proper recognition for all of the areas which they showed strength, or they showed growth, or they achieved or met our standards. We also need to share with them our concerns. There are what we call opportunities for growth. These are areas where maybe they're not rising and meeting the standard, that maybe something has come up and been presented as a weakness or a deficiency. And we need to be able, in that performance evaluation, be able to say to them, these are the areas that you have we have some concerns in, or some areas where you fall short, or where we see that there's a little bit of a deficiency and we need you to grow to meet the expected standard. So in a performance evaluation, we're going to give them the good stuff, the things that they're achieving and doing well. We're also going to share with them our concerns or things that they need to correct moving forward. And then we also need to have in a performance evaluation an area for long-term development. So we do another workshop where we talk about motivating underpaid staff. And this is one of the principles that we have in that training that I think crosses over into this one. We need to recognize that for most people, the position they're in now is a stepping stone for them. We probably are not giving them their ideal job. And so if we can recognize that, that's not always true, but it's mostly true. If we can recognize that, then when we talk about long-term development, we can do that in association with their performance evaluation. So these are things you're doing well. These are things that we have some concerns about. You need to shore up. But here are some ways that you can get some long-term development and grow in the areas that are of interest to you. So it's providing them opportunity to develop personally in areas that they're interested in that will benefit the organization, but will also benefit them as they're moving forward in their career. So the 3 parameters that are really should be part of every performance evaluation are recognition and achievement, recognition of what they've done well and where they've met the parameters or the goals or expectations. The second is the concerns and opportunities for growth. And then the third is providing ways that they can have some long-term development and grow into the areas that they're interested in. So all of those pieces are part of really doing an effective performance evaluation. So now we're going to move into looking at some principles of effective performance evaluations and some practical how-tos on how to do this well. So as with many things in our work environment, timing is really important. So we need to have a time every year with our employees or with our board or with our CEO or executive director that we are planning a one-on-one meeting specifically to talk about performance evaluation. It makes sense that this would come at the time that maybe their anniversary date is. Others like to have all of their performance evaluations done at the same time of the year. So maybe when there's less activity, perhaps in the summer for some organizations, or it could be at the beginning of the year. But you find a place one time a year that you are going to have a performance evaluation planned for this particular employee. So it gets a little tricky if you have many employees and you don't have a formal HR director or somebody that this is their main task. And so we want to be aware that we need to do an evaluation for every employee. We need to do this with our board, and we need to make sure that there's a time that our executive director or CEO has an evaluation done, and make sure that we're planning that out so it's a routine thing that happens every year. So an annual planned meeting that's one-on-one between the supervisor and the employee that happens in a predictable time every year. We also need to have time for ongoing discussions. So if you have a time that you meet with employees one-on-one to talk about their activities or the program they're involved with, or you have some kind of staff meeting that's routine, that can be a time to work into that agenda some ongoing discussions about how they're doing with their position. So it becomes part of the culture and part of the ongoing conversation that happens with employees, where you're talking about their job performance on an ongoing basis. It can be at a monthly meeting, it can be weekly. You can kind of decide what makes sense. But other than just the one time a year that we're doing a formal evaluation, we need to work into the culture in our organization some ongoing discussions that are occurring. The third thing relative to timing is to set aside plenty of time for the annual review. You want this to be a time that is a conversation. You want it to not be just presenting them with a form that they read and sign. You want to make sure that there's enough time that you all can talk and spend some significant time talking about their role in the organization, what challenges they may have that they may want to discuss. You don't want it to be rushed. So you want to make sure that you're setting plenty of time aside to do annual reviews. Don't make that happen in 10 minutes. This isn't something you send to them via email and then you just have a 10-minute follow-up. It needs to be something that is set aside with plenty of time to be thorough and not rush the conversation. Another principle, other than just timing, is there are some things to think about in terms of doing performance evaluations. I think if most of us have been around a while, we've probably seen this done poorly, and hopefully we've seen this done well for us personally, where we're getting feedback about our performance evaluations. From the perspective of you being the one to give out the performance evaluations, there are some general principles that we want to make sure we have in place so that our conversations can be impactful and effective. We do not want to use performance evaluations, and particularly our one-on-one sessions. We do not want to gunny sack, which means we're not sharing our ongoing concerns with them, but we are laying everything that's wrong with them out in one particular meeting. Gunny sacking involves not sharing as we go, but really holding on to everything that we're concerned about or angry about or disappointed about and putting it all on them during this one-on-one meeting. One of the things that timing, when you have ongoing discussions about performance, one of the advantages of that is that it prevents this from happening. So if there's a concern that I have with an employee, I can share that in their one-on-one meetings. I'm not waiting till their performance evaluation and then unloading on them all of the things I saw over the year that were wrong. That's not reasonable, and that's not fair to the employee, and it's not fair to the organization. We want to make sure that we're not using this one-on-one annual meeting to just unload all of our frustrations on them. So we don't want to gunny sack. We want to be able to share concerns over the course of the year as those present. We also don't want to use this as a springboard for all new things that we're going to expect of them. None of the performance evaluation conversation should be much of a surprise to them if we're doing this well. So if we're going to require new duties of them, or we're going to adjust their position in some way, it shouldn't be just completely foreign to them and presented to them at this meeting to springboard a whole new concept. We want to use the annual performance review to give some due consideration for how they're doing in the organization, have a conversation with them, but don't use it to either gunny sack or springboard to do new things off of this particular one-on-one meeting. We also want to make sure, as another principle for doing an effective evaluation, that we are transparent with them. It is very frustrating to feel like you're not getting the full story when you're receiving an evaluation. We need to make sure that we are honest with them, that we are transparent, that we don't have any hidden agenda, but that we are giving them a really good, honest feedback about how they're doing, the good and the bad, as well as the development pieces that I already mentioned. But we want to be transparent with them. Don't leave anything unsaid. Make sure that you're being completely open with them about what your concerns are and the good stuff about what you really see that they've excelled in or have really gone above and beyond in. So we want to make sure that we're being transparent. And of course, that's linked to the next one of being honest with them. We do not want to use this as a time to overinflate or build them up in a way that's not reasonable or honest. We don't want to give them the impression that they are doing far more and above what we imagined. But we also don't want to be overly critical. We want to check ourselves as far as our role in evaluating them to make sure that we're not criticizing them in a way that's not reasonable or fair. We want to make sure that we're seeing the whole picture of who they are as an employee, the value that they bring. So we don't want to overemphasize an area that they may be strong in or overly criticize an area where they may have a weakness. We want to make sure that we're being balanced in our approach with them while maintaining some honesty and transparency with how we're delivering the message. We also want to be consistent. And this is consistent with them as an employee, but it's also consistent in terms of how we're evaluating all of our employees. We're people, and sometimes when we're doing evaluations, there are some people that are easier for us to manage than others. There are some people that we may prefer or like more than others. And we want to make sure that we're checking ourselves as supervisors or managers or those that are giving evaluations to make sure we're being fair and consistent with how we're doing performance evaluations. One of the complaints I hear from people that have received evaluations, particularly when I'm talking to executive directors, is that there's not consistency year to year. So one year they're made to feel like they're doing a great job, and the next year they're kind of raked over the coals. And that makes it very difficult to perform well as an employee. And so we want to make sure that when we're giving evaluations that we're consistent, that we're looking at the whole picture, and that we're making sure that from year to year, or as we're doing this over the course of the year with our employees through conversations, that we're giving a consistent message. It comes back to making sure that there are reasonable standards that we're measuring against, and that we're being consistent with how we're measuring the success of an employee. So some other things to think about when we're thinking about how do we do a performance evaluation. There are some things that we're going to need in hand in order to be able to evaluate them effectively. So we're going to walk through some of the tools, but prior to the tools, there's some information that we're going to need to have readily available to us if we're going to do an effective performance evaluation. One of those things is a job description. I mentioned earlier that everybody that's getting a performance evaluation needs to have a job description. So if I'm going to be evaluating an employee, I need to make sure that I have their job description in hand. A job description makes it very clear what they're supposed to be doing. So it reminds me as a supervisor what they were hired to do or what's on their task list to do, so that I'm being reasonable in how I'm evaluating them and their performance. So having that job description on hand is really important at the start of this process. I also need to have any annual goals that may have been laid out for them. So if we're doing ongoing performance evaluations, there may be some goals that we had laid out for them in the previous year. I'm going to want to refresh my memory on those. What were those? How have those gone over the last year? I'm going to be thinking in terms of that. So I need to make sure that when I'm going to do an evaluation that I have those things in mind. If we're talking about a board evaluation, boards also need to have job descriptions. We're not going to do an evaluation of individual board members, but we are going to talk about evaluating the entirety of the board and how they're doing. So making sure we know what the board's role and responsibilities are and what their goals were for the year, so that when we are talking about evaluating them, those things are fresh. So it's the same concept for both of those types of evaluations. We also need information about a manager's direct experience and observations. So that would be me in this scenario. If I'm the one giving the evaluation, or you, if you're giving your staff evaluations, you want to know what your direct experience is and your observations, to be very clear about what their job responsibilities were, and to think through some examples of, I know that she does this really well. Here are some examples I can pull from my experience that would show that she does this really well. I want to be thinking through what those things are. And then what have I observed about their behavior or observed about their performance in general? So to be thinking about my specific observations, my experience, that would suggest whether or not I feel like they've done their job duties well over the last year. I also want to pull not just from my own experience and observations, but other people's experience and observations. So if there's another manager that I can say, what's your thought about the way John Smith does this particular thing? I can get their observations and experiences. It also is part of creating a culture of effective evaluations and looking at staff meetings and what people have said or observed about this particular worker in regard to different tasks that they do. So I want to pull in other people's experience and observations. I don't want to be limited to just what my experience might be. It's also good to pull in information from meeting notes, summaries, compliments, concerns from your customers or your clients, the other annual reviews that you've done, other performance documents, anything that will help give a fuller picture or more clear picture or a more representative picture of how this particular employee or how the board does their job. All of us have our specific vantage point. And so when we're observing our own employee and how they've worked, we can certainly know some things relative to our vantage point. But it's important when we're talking about performance evaluation that it's not just my opinion, but I'm pulling in other people's experience and perspectives and anything else that helps me give a full picture of how this employee might be doing. So for us, we have a lot of interface with clients in a lot of different capacities. And so when I hear a compliment that this person does this particularly well, I'm kind of tucking that back in my mind so that when we do an evaluation, I can refresh about that. So looking at a complete picture that's representative of everyone that employee touches in the work environment is just going to help you do your job better when you talk about doing an effective performance evaluation. Couple other things that you need to gather before you are doing this one-on-one. You want to make sure that you have a performance or evaluation form. You don't want to just have a conversation. You want this to be something that's in writing. And there are a couple reasons for that. One is in any kind of good HR policy or human relations policy, human resources policy, you want to make sure that you have something in their personnel file that says this is their performance over this term. It's just good HR policy to have performance reviews and evaluations in a personnel file. Also, when you can put it in writing, it helps to give you some clarity to make sure that you are representing what you think well and that it's in a place that it can be objective. It's important that when we're doing performance evaluations that the staff person have the ability to see it. It can't just be verbal. We need to have something in writing. And so in order to do that, we need to make sure that we have an acceptable performance or evaluation form that helps guide our conversation and our findings or our sharing with them what we're observing or how we're evaluating them in a way that's consistent. And so having a good performance evaluation form is really important to that process. I'm going to share with you some of those evaluation tools that we use and that we like, but kind of give you an idea of some things that can be on those evaluation forms. But find one that you like and use it consistently across your staff. The next thing that you're going to make sure and need as you are gathering information for this process is what the next steps are. So be thinking about, do you have the ability to give increases? Is that something that your culture allows or is expected? Do you give performance-based raises or merit increases? Is that something that you want to consider for this particular staff person? What other goals might you have for this person? When you're reviewing what you talked about last year, were there specific things that you got that they were interested in, personal goals they might have, or goals that you have for them in the organization. Thinking about what might be coming down the pike over the next year for them in terms of goals. And if there are needed improvements, what do you want those to look like in terms of being in writing? Do you have specific objectives you want them to meet? Is there a particular standard you're needing them to meet? Think through what from your vantage point or your perspective, what those next steps are going to be. That's not something you want to spring on or not have thought about when you're doing a one-on-one meeting with them. You want to think through prior to that effective performance evaluation what those next steps in the process are going to be. And then, of course, when you're preparing for all of this, gathering all the information, setting the time aside, making sure that you are ready for this meeting, there are some things in the approach that are going to be equally important to what the actual information is that you're presenting. Approach is really important to make sure that this is an effective performance evaluation, which is what our goal is here. The first one that we're going to talk about is the mutual understanding of the evaluation tool. So we have here at CDP, when I do a performance evaluation, we have a tool that we use, and it's a five-point scale. And it's not from 1 to 5 how effective. Each number means something different. So a 0 means they're absolutely not doing it at all. A 1 means they're doing it, but not quite to the standard. A 2 means they're meeting the standard that's required of them. And so a perfect performance evaluation could be all 2s, meaning that they are meeting the standard as to what the expectation is for their position. So a 3, 4, and 5 doesn't mean they're doing it better, or it doesn't mean that they're meeting the expectation in a better way. Those have different meanings. And so my point is, when you have an evaluation tool that you find that you like, make sure that both you as the manager and the person receiving the performance evaluation understand the tool, understand how it's laid out, what it's measuring, how the whole tool is put together, so that there's an understanding of what they're looking at when they're looking at their performance evaluation in this tool. In addition to understanding the tool, you want to give the employee opportunity to complete that ahead of time. The way that I like to do performance evaluations on any of the 3 that we're going to talk about, whether it's the executive director, whether it's the board evaluating themselves, or individual staff people, is you want to give people an opportunity to see the tool ahead of time and to complete it themselves. So I like to have the staff person complete the tool, and I'm completing the tool ahead of time. We're not trying to do that during our one-on-one meeting. That gives opportunity for us to discuss those different areas that they're being evaluated against, and have a conversation, give our opinions, address the concerns, really have some good conversation about their performance. So giving them opportunity to complete that ahead of time is really a great way to make sure you have an effective evaluation. I like to do that about a week ahead of time, but you can kind of decide what makes sense for your organization. But giving them plenty of time to do that would be helpful in making this more effective. You also want to make sure, again, that you've outlined what the job expectations are. So making sure that it's very clear what the job description is. Again, having that information handy is important. Any previous performance reviews that they've had, what their expected goals were for the year, making sure all of that is very clear. This is the expectation and what you're being measured against. And then the next bullet then is measuring against those expectations. So it's not reasonable to evaluate someone against an expectation they didn't know we had for them. So that's why having everything in writing is really important. So during that conversation, we're going to measure them against those expectations. Nothing else other than what has been outlined for them against their job description or performance reviews or other goals that we have set out for them in writing. Another thing to be thinking about, especially in terms of when you're giving them compliments on their achievements, and on the other end of the spectrum, if there are things that are concerns or places they're falling short, we want to make sure we have clear examples. So it's not enough to say, I don't like how you talk to people, if I'm evaluating someone on their interactions with other people. I have to have clear examples that I can give them for how they fell short in that area. So be thinking through ahead of time 2 or 3 examples of where they fell short. Or if I'm giving them a lot of kudos about achieving in a certain area, I want to also have examples of how they exceeded expectations or how they met that goal in a really strong way. So on both ends of the spectrum, I want to make sure I have clear examples to share with the person that I'm evaluating that shows that I really do think they exceeded and this is why, or they really fell short and here's some examples and why. It's another good check for us as managers to make sure we're not taking one instance where they might have had a bad day and blowing that out of proportion. So if we had one rude comment that was said 6 months ago, but 99% of the time, everything is really, the interface with other staff is really good, then I don't want to just pull out that one isolated example. I want to make sure that if I'm addressing something in evaluation, it's something that has several clear examples of how they're doing it well or how they're falling short. Another important how-to when we're doing a performance evaluation is to make sure that you're not doing all of the talking. We need to make sure that we are listening to the employee, or as if we're evaluating in a board setting, that we're hearing what people are saying. Everyone has a different vantage point and a different perspective on their position. And so we need to make sure that we're listening to how they perceive things, where they are with things. If there are corrective actions that we may need to make as a supervisor, we need to be open to that. But we need to not just be lecturing them, but it needs to be a conversation. So make sure that you are listening to their vantage point, their perspective, what their thoughts are about how they're doing something, because we'll learn a lot as managers or supervisors by listening to the people that we're evaluating. Another important point in doing evaluations is to recognize this needs to be objective. This isn't about attacking them. It's not about, when we talked about not gunny sacking or springboarding, an evaluation needs to not be an emotive thing. This isn't emotional. It's really not even personal. It's an objective evaluation of their performance based on what their job is and what the expectations are. That being said, we're people, and there are some people that we're going to be able to interface with more effectively than others. But as the person giving the evaluation, we need to avoid being emotive or too emotional about it. We need to keep it objective and not personal. We also need to stick to the evaluation form. So that's where it's important to have a strong and effective form when we're doing evaluations. We need to stick to that. Don't let yourself go on a lot of bunny trails or go off topic or talk about things that aren't relevant to how we're evaluating performance. Stick to the form and follow the form when you're having the conversation. Sometimes if we're doing a particularly difficult review, we may need to have a second meeting. We do a training on different personalities, and there are some personalities, thinkers and friends, who are not quick decision makers. It takes them some time to think things through. They need to process information. And so if someone's getting a particularly difficult review, they may need to walk away and process some things before you can continue to have a conversation about next steps for them as an employee. And so sometimes as managers, we need to recognize we might need a second meeting rather than trying to accomplish everything in one meeting. And you'll kind of know that intuitively with different staff that you have, or if you have a particularly volatile board or people that have to externally process things. Sometimes a second meeting will be necessary. So we need to be prepared for that. And so if we're having a review with someone and we've set 90 minutes aside to have that review, and yet we're not quite getting done with the conversation, it's okay to have a second meeting or a follow-up to that conversation. Above everything else, when we're having these conversations and review, we need to make sure we're respectful and professional. We are in a position, in a role, in a management capacity where we are having these difficult evaluations or having to give an evaluation based on somebody's performance, whether it's difficult or whether it's really positive. And we need to make sure that regardless of how they respond, that we stay respectful and professional. We are objective observers of their performance in this job, and we need to approach it in that way. It may be that we need to take a break. We may need to step back in order to maintain our composure and to continue to be respectful and professional. We're not robots, and I get that. And some evaluations can be more difficult than others. Sometimes we have a volatile employee that we're having to address with some difficult things. We need to know that maybe we need to take a break if we are going to maintain our composure and continue to be respectful and professional. It's a non-negotiable when you're doing a performance evaluation that you be respectful and professional. So know when you need to regroup and come back to the conversation later, and it's perfectly acceptable to do that. It's important, again, I mentioned this before, but to make sure everything is in writing. So nothing that we discuss in a performance evaluation that's substantive should just be a verbal. Everything that matters should be in writing. It should be in a performance evaluation form. It should be part of this evaluation so that everything is in writing. Performance evaluations need to be brought to consensus where it's at all possible. There is an authority that the supervisor or manager has. So if you're at odds with a particular issue, you don't see things the same way, that's okay. That can be noted. But the evaluation as a whole needs to be signed by the supervisor and the employee. So this is our record that this occurred. These may be things that we have some dissension about or things that we don't agree on. You can note those in the evaluation. But an effective performance evaluation needs to be signed by both the supervisor and the employee. It also, again, as I mentioned earlier, gets filed in the employee file or the personnel file. It's a record of that employment in the organization, and so it needs to be signed and filed appropriately. It also should be available for review. So if there's an employee that wants to see what the review looked like 3 years ago, as an employer, we should be able to provide that to them, and it should be available to them. Now, my employee files are not open to everyone, just the employee and myself. And so we need to make sure that there is proper control of those personnel files. It can be a very difficult situation if one employee gets a hold of another employee's performance evaluation. That should not happen. So there should be protocol for those being locked up, that they aren't open to everyone. But an employee should be able to review their own performance evaluation if they so choose. So those are some practical tips on how to do performance evaluations well. There are also some things that we just want to walk through to avoid when you're doing an evaluation. Again, our goal is to do an effective performance evaluation. So halos and horns are kind of how we put it here. You really don't want to over-focus on extremes. And so you don't want to make them out to be this amazing, fabulous employee and it's all goodness and light. That would be the halo version. You don't want to overemphasize things that they do. You want to be reasonable and realistic in your evaluations. So you don't want to make them out to be a saint, but you also don't want to make them out to be horrid creatures either, the horns piece. So you don't want to over-focus on extremes. That's where you want to make sure you have 2 or 3 examples of things, that there's that we're not over-emphasizing any one particular instance, but that we're looking at their performance over the total of a year to make sure that we're giving them an effective and accurate evaluation. So this can come into play with employees that we really like or employees that we don't care for. And so we need to kind of make sure that we're putting our own personal stuff aside and that we're able to be objective in giving them good feedback on their performance. Kind of lends itself into the next point, which is the part becomes the whole. So we don't want one incident to be the whole assessment, whether that's good or bad. We want to make sure that we're looking at the whole of the whole year and making sure that we're emphasizing the things that are consistent over the course of the year. So sometimes if there's one particular incident where they were the hero and it was just an amazing thing, we can tend to really emphasize that in the performance evaluation. And the opposite is also true, where there's maybe a terrible incident that occurred, but it was just an isolated incident. We don't want that to become the whole either. So we want to make sure that we are looking at the entire year and not just particular incidents that happened. The next bullet then is the lack of evidence. Again, we want to make sure that we have clear examples to match the assessment, both good and bad. So it isn't enough just to go with your hunch or your overall impression. We need to take time as supervisors to make sure that we are providing appropriate and accurate evidence of why this is true. So really looking at your clear examples and doing giving some clear thought to that prior to the evaluation. The next thing we want to avoid is really hollow criticism. It goes back to maybe those employees that you don't care so much for, making sure that we're not just criticizing what they do, but we need to be constructive. So anything that we put as a shortcoming in the evaluation, we need to make sure we can give them steps for how to improve that. So they may have really messed up in a particular area. As to do an effective evaluation and be constructive moving forward, we need to provide them steps that they can take to improve in that area. We need to give them the training they need or the coaching they need, not just throw out all the shortcomings without giving them ways that they can rectify that or improve that. So you want to avoid hollow criticism that doesn't have the partner of constructive ways that they can improve. Another one that should be kind of obvious is we want to avoid gut feelings and opinions over facts. It really doesn't matter what my opinion is about someone. I need to look at the evidence and what it suggests. And so this gets back into those employees that we may like better than others, or employees that we may not like, or in a board situation, it can be, I don't really like my board too well, so I'm going to give them, just kind of give a gut feeling about that they're not doing their job well. We need to avoid that. We need to, again, look for those evidence. It doesn't matter what my opinion is. It really matters what the facts are. And so really avoiding just responding in an evaluation to gut feelings or just an opinion. Another one that's can be kind of difficult is this whole idea of longevity doesn't equal competence. So we can have boards or board members that have been parts of boards for 30 years. I always say that doesn't mean they did it well for 30 years. And so we can have the same thing with staff. If we've had a staff person that's been there 10 years, that doesn't mean that they're doing their job super well. So just because they've been there a long time doesn't mean that they don't have some things to improve on. And the converse is true. Just because someone's new and fresh doesn't necessarily mean they're doing their job well or not well. So we can't really take the longevity or the amount of time someone's been there and equate that to whether they're doing their job well or not. We need to look beyond the time element and really look at what the standard is and are they meeting that. The next thing is kind of an interesting one when we say don't mistake inconvenience for incompetence. Just because someone doesn't play the rules the same way that you want them to, or if they inconvenient you in some way, doesn't mean they're not doing their job well. We want to make sure that we have a standardized and objective way of measuring someone's performance. And because they don't communicate the way we like, or they don't handle things the way that we like, and it is more time intensive for me as a manager, doesn't mean they're not doing their job well. So we need to make sure that we are objectively looking at what the standard is for their performance, and are they meeting that standard. So that's just kind of a thing to think about in terms of being inconvenienced as a manager, things to not do. We don't want to mistake inconvenience for that person being incompetent. Another kind of factoid that is important for us to know in management is that performance appraisals or evaluations, when they are coupled with specific job expectations, help boost performance. Our goal is to have effective employees. And so if we do this well, then we will have a boost in performance. We want to make sure employees understand what their expectations are, that those are in writing, they know what standards we are requiring them to meet, and that we are giving them a performance evaluation based on that. That will help them do their job better, which ultimately is our goal. So we're going to walk through, and I know we spend a lot of time on the how-tos and all of that, but that's really the meat of how to do performance evaluations well. The next thing we're going to look at are the different types of evaluations and some specifics about those, and then I'll introduce the actual tools to you. So the first one we're going to look at is when we do effective performance evaluations in nonprofits. One of those that we need to do is a board evaluation. Board evaluation should be done annually, and a board evaluation is not individual board members, how they're necessarily doing, but I care as a whole, how is the board doing? Boards have specific roles and responsibilities in nonprofits, and we need to make sure that they are evaluating themselves every year. So an annual board evaluation of how are we doing as a board, where are we falling short, and how can we do this better? So that needs to be done annually. You can assess individual board members and the effectiveness of the whole board. I'm not as interested in the individuals, only as it relates to how the whole board is impacted. But we have a tool that we use where individual board members can say, I'm doing a good job here, or I'm not doing so well. But as an organization, we're really interested in how the whole board is performing. And so the board evaluation can be used for both of those purposes. We should always include steps for improvement. So none of us arrive. We all have areas in which we can improve. And so one of the things we want to make sure and do in a board evaluation is include steps for how do they become better board members? How do they become a better board together? How do we improve our performance when we talk about doing a board evaluation? The board evaluation also is the responsibility of the board chair to make sure it gets done. So your board chair, your board president needs to be the one making sure that we're evaluating the board each year. Same principle as we talked about in general evaluations, everything should be in writing. It should also be filed and available for review so that we are having an ongoing assessment for how our board is doing. And it's very interesting to go back and look at previous board evaluations and see how even some of the improvements, or if boards are declining in their effectiveness, some of that can be shored up with some additional training. But we want to make sure that our boards are staying functional and operating in ways that they should. And so evaluations are an important piece of that. In terms of the executive director is CEO, that is the person in charge of the day-to-day details of the organization. That also should be done annually. It's the responsibility of the board to do that. Sometimes boards will establish committees, like a personnel committee, to do that, or the executive committee will do that. But the responsibility is on the board as a whole to make sure that the executive director or the CEO is evaluated every year. Again, everything should be in writing. The same process we talked through with the general evaluations, getting them ahead of time, using a consistent tool, measuring what the expectations are and how you're performing against those. All of that holds true when we talk about executive director or CEO. Should be in writing. Everything should be filed, again, in their personnel file, and you should be able to review that if you're the executive director or CEO. You want to make sure that you have access to your personnel file and that you can see those evaluations as you go if you would like to. In terms of specifics for a staff evaluation, again, those should be annual, but you should also have those ongoing conversations throughout the year. It would be the responsibility of whoever's in charge of the day-to-day operations, so your executive director or your CEO or the immediate supervisor if you have multiple tiers of management. So whoever the immediate supervisor is should be the person evaluating that particular staff person. Okay, now I'm going to call your attention to the actual forms that I have there for you in the handout section. There are some different evaluations that are there for you to look at. And we're going to just kind of walk through those. I'm not going to go through every one of those because we're now at a little past 1. So I'm not going to take a whole lot of time to do that. But I did want to walk through the tools with you so that you have an idea of what you're looking at. The first one I'm going to kind of walk you through is it's a 33 question tool for boards. So it says Nonprofit Board Evaluation Tool. This is a great tool for boards to assess how they're doing and for the individual board members to use to determine how they're doing. So you can use this to measure how I'm effective as a board member, but also in general, how is the organization doing? So the first kind of section here, and it kind of follows our 6 components of a nonprofit, asks some questions pertaining to all 6 of those. Do I understand my roles and responsibility? Do I take my fiscal and legal responsibilities for the organization well? Do I know the mission of the organization? Am I knowledgeable about the organization? Kind of talks through all of those things. Am I coming to meetings prepared? Are we sticking to our agenda? Are we effective? Are we using committees? So it kind of walks through just those 6 components of what makes a healthy nonprofit. It's 33 questions. You are welcome to use this tool if you want to send it to your board members ahead of time and then have them do a self-evaluation. You can do that. If you want to walk through all of this in a meeting, that can be effective as well. But all boards, and there are lots of examples, you can Google different nonprofit board evaluation tools and find others. I like this one because it's very clear. And again, it kind of follows our model for our 6 components of a healthy nonprofit. But there are lots of examples. The goal is to get your board into the habit of evaluating themselves at least annually. The second tool that we're going to look at is the executive director or CEO evaluation. Again, this falls using our 6 components of a healthy nonprofit. It's fairly long. Excuse me. It's a fairly extensive evaluation. You certainly can find other evaluation tools. Again, just by Googling, you'll see lots of examples. But this is, I like this one because it follows our 6 components pretty clearly. It is fairly extensive, but it gives you a good indication of where the executive director or CEO is performing well and where they may need some additional help. This is using that Likert 5-point scale from strongly agree down to strongly disagree, and it gives some good discussion so that when you are meeting with the executive director and members of the board it can kind of give you some ideas about where they feel like they're doing really strong, or where you are as an executive director doing really well, and where you aren't quite sure about where you're excelling or not. And so it just kind of gives a very clear indication of where you're doing or how you're doing as a CEO or executive director. On the final page, or really underneath all of the different components, it gives you a comment section. And I like that, so that it gives the CEO or executive director some way to comment back about things that maybe they're not sure of, or where they feel like they're not doing as well, or maybe even areas that they feel like they really have excelled. Having some comments under each of the sections kind of gives a place to kind of vent and talk about some other things that may have been sparked using these different questions. And then at the end, to kind of have an overall comment, additional comments for other things that are impressions or examples that you may have when you're reviewing this with your executive director or CEO. The third performance evaluation tool is the one that we use. I had referred this to this during the webinar, but we use this particular performance evaluation with our staff here. And I like it because I like the things that it measures. I think it gives some good indications of the quality of the work, and are they doing it well? Are they meeting expectations? And it gives some clear ideas of where they might be able to shore up. But again, the performance definitions are important to understand. So as I mentioned earlier, 2 is acceptable. It means they're meeting their job requirements. And so when we talk about things like, are the hours, are they complying with their work hours? Well, they are or they aren't. So that's likely not going to be a 4, that they're exceptional in meeting their work hours. If they're meeting them, then they are meeting the acceptable work hours. That would be a 2. So I like this performance evaluation. It talks about the quality of their work. How did they perform their work? It talks about the quantity. Are they meeting their expectations in terms of quantity of work that they're doing? Knowledge. Do they know what they're supposed to be doing? Are they knowledgeable in handling the different aspects of their job? Human relations. How do they get along with other people? Are they willing to work with others? Do they work well with others? Communication. Some jobs require better communication than others, but are they able to do that effectively? Judgment. Are they able to make decisions? Do you have to micromanage them? Kind of gives you a sense of are they able to make decisions on their own? Job dependability walks through that. Attitude gives some room to talk about, particularly with maybe personalities that are a little more difficult. Gives you a place to kind of address some of those things, even if they're doing their job really well, to address some things related to attitude or initiative, and then give some additional comments. The second page of this is what I really like about this one. It gives you a place to do an overall performance rating, but I really like the next step, which is what else. So when I talked about being able to lay out goals and development goals for staff, this particular tool gives you that built in. So describe goals and objectives that you have, and having the staff complete this ahead of time gives you a really good indication when you're coming back together of how they're envisioning this for themselves. What else do they want to learn or grow in knowledge of? And so giving them some ownership of what their goals and objectives will be. Anything else that they might be interested in gives them an opportunity to talk about that, and any other comments that they have. So I really like this evaluation tool. It's pretty simplistic, especially when you compare it to the BET or the executive director evaluation. But it is covering the things that I think are really strong and important to cover in terms of performance. And so you are welcome to take these and use these if these are helpful to you in your organizations. And think through kind of what you like as you kind of go through these, what you like about these, what you don't like about these, how would you change these, and then, modify those or find tools that have a modification that meet kind of what you're looking at in terms of doing evaluations. So that is the webinar. I am available to field any questions that you might have about any of that information. If there are things that you want to have answered or anything else that you would like to see covered. Otherwise, what I'll do is I'll put up my contact information. Again, my name is Mindy Muller. That's our phone number. You can see our general email there or my personal email. You are welcome to follow up with questions following the webinar if you would like. Or if you want to visit our website, see what else we have coming up, you're welcome to do that as well, communitydevelopmentprofessionals.com. I thank you for your attention today. I hope this has been helpful for you, and good luck in your performance evaluations moving forward. Have a great day.